Let me tell you a secret, Ned. More than once I have dreamed of giving up the crown. Take ship for the free cities with my horse and my hammer. Spend my time warring and whoring. That's what I was made for. The sellsword king. How the singers would love me. Rhaegar Targaryen, the spawn of the Mad King, had not been at the Battle of the Trident. The Silver Prince had stayed at the Tower of Joy, and had entrusted his host to Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, and Gerold Hightower, the White Bull. Dayne had died in the river there, his skull crushed by Robert Baratheon's mighty warhammer, and the White Bull too had perished, stabbed in the back by Howland Reed, while fighting Eddard Stark, the Silent Prince. Lord Eddard Stark, called Ned, the second son of the late Lord of Winterfell, rode south to Dorne as fast as his horse would carry him. Eddard had a personal interest in seeing Prince Rhaegar brought to justice and in ending the House of the Dragon. His father, Lord Rickard Stark, and his brother, Brandon Stark, had been burned by a pyromancer's fire on the orders of Rhaegar's father, Aerys Targaryen, the Mad King. Lord Rickard had perished in the flames, slowly cooking inside of his armor, while Brandon, Ned's older brother, had barely escaped with his life. The once jovial and charming young Brandon, the new Lord of Winterfell, was now a bedridden husk of his former self, crippled, scarred, and bitter. To add insult to injury, Prince Rhaegar had kidnapped Ned's sister Lyanna and imprisoned her in the Tower of Joy. It was to this tower that Ned was riding, sorrow about the injustice done to his family coursing through his head, only occasionally replaced with fury and determination to save his sister and enact well-deserved justice on the Targaryen prince who had kidnapped her. But when he arrived, he found nothing but an empty tower. The Silver Prince had cowered off to Old Town, taking a pregnant Lyanna with him. With the victory at the Trident, Robert Baratheon's rebellion was won, but it was a hollow victory for the new king. When Ned arrived in King's Landing, he found a court in mourning. Lyanna had given birth to Rhaegar's son, and now lay buried in an old town garden, having died in childbirth. Rhaegar had taken a ship and fled off to far-off Pentos, taking the babe with him, and stopping at Dragonstone to pick up a pregnant Queen Rhaella, together with the boy Viserys, the Mad King's son and heir. King Robert had loved his betrothed Lyanna dearly, and upon hearing the news of his love's demise, had barely left his quarters, wallowing in fury and despair. Ned spent hours emptying a wineskin with his friend the king, and slowly the storm returned to the Stormlander. Ned also visited his crippled and broken brother, Brandon, the new Lord Paramount of the North. But the once virile man had seen his father burned alive, and he directed all of his anger and hatred at Ned. Ned would never forget the words that his brother uttered from the sickbed. "If you loved us half as much as you loved your honor, little brother, Lyanna might still be alive. It would be better if you stayed south with your king. Now get out." Ned had been banished from the north, and he expected disinherited. With this in mind, Ned joined Robert's first small council meeting. Present was their friend and mentor, Jon Arryn, Lord of the Vale, and Robert's stern, sour younger brother, Stannis, cheeks still hollow from the siege of Storm's End. The council meeting was dominated by a full-blown argument on the matter of what to do with Rhaegar Targaryen and his dragon ilk, holed up in Pentos. Jon and Stannis saw no alternative than to write a letter, thinking that they would never get the Lords of the Seven Kingdoms to follow them into a war with the Free Cities. This was unacceptable to Robert and to Ned. Justice must be served. "Rhaegar Targaryen must die," he said. "There can be no compromise on this." "The King of the Seven Kingdoms cannot go to war with Pentos," Jon said. "No great lord will follow you in this, Robert." Robert's face darkened with fury. He ripped the crown off his brow and tossed it to Stannis, who caught it before it tumbled to the ground, looking like he'd been struck across the face. "Then Stannis can have the bloody thing, and the Lannister wench with it," he said. "I'll be going to Pentos even if I have to row that boat myself." He turned to Eddard and hesitated. "Ned?" Always, Eddard replied, and spoke the word like an oath. Long live Stannis Baratheon, he thought. First of his name, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar and the First Men, Protector of the Realm. Screaming followed, but the decision was made. And so the dragon hunt began. The call went out from the Red Keep to all able-bodied men in Westeros. Robert Baratheon would abdicate the throne to his brother, and all who would join him in hunting down and killing Rhaegar Targaryen would be richly rewarded with Essosi land and Essosi gold. No great lord might follow him, but Robert Baratheon was still beloved in all the realm, and there were plenty of misfits, second sons, exiles, men eager to regain their honor, the destitute looking for easy plunder, and simple glory hounds eager for adventure, who wished to aid in this dragon hunt. The next months were spent gathering men and materials for the crossing, and coming up with a pile of gold needed for such an endeavor. Luckily, there was still plenty of gold in the Targaryen treasury, although King Stannis would later begrudge his brother for leaving him with a near-bankrupt realm. But there were still arrangements to be made to keep the realm together. First and foremost, Lord Tywin Lannister, the man responsible for the sack of King's Landing and the death of Princess Elia and her children, needed to be placated. Knowing Stannis, once king, would execute Tywin's son Jaime Lannister for breaking his oath, and thus return the realm to civil war, Jon Arryn pleaded with Robert to pardon him before it would come to that. Robert did. The Kingslayer was stripped of his white cloak and sentenced to fight with the Dragonhunt for 7 years. In addition, Cersei Lannister, Tywin's daughter, would wed the future King Stannis. Though the arrangement wasn't popular with either the Lannister twins or Stannis, Lord Tywin himself was pleased. With Tywin Lannister satisfied, the halls of the Red Keep started filling with good men. One of the more remarkable among them was legendary commander Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, brother to Lord Hoster Tully of the Riverlands, who said, "Hoster has begun baying about marriage again. It occurs to me I am not yet too old for one last fool war." Many more lords and their entourage trickled into King's Landing. Tywin Lannister sent his brother, Geryon Lannister, and a host of Westerlander fighters to protect his son and heir and aid in the dragon hunt. Ned Stark also commanded a lot of loyalty still in the north, with some preferring to pledge loyalty to him instead of his crippled brother, although to overthrow his family would go against his honor. Howland Reed quietly announced his intent to join his friend Ned, taking with him half of his Crannock men. Mage and Daisy Mormont joined with the host from Bear Island. From the Glovers came Sir Ethan, from the Karstarks Sir Arnolf and Sir Cregan, from the Umbers came Greyjoy, and all of these men also commanded a significant host. But allies were needed, and the realm's coffers were running empty. Ned Stark travelled with the jovial Geryon Lannister to Braavos, on his ship, the Laughing Lion. Geryon's jokes and japes annoyed the stoic northerner at first, but in time Ned grew a liking to the blonde and smiling Lannister. The two new friends spent some heady, perfumed days in smoky rooms behind silk curtains. Alliances were brokered and coin was bargained for. The Iron Bank granted a large loan on decent terms, knowing it would be used to take down their rivals in Pentos. A deal was also brokered with the Tattered Prince, captain of the Windblown, who claimed to have once been the Prince of Pentos, to fight the city together with Robert's dragon hunt. And Ned, the stern northerner, so out of place in this land of sweet wine and smooth dresses, spent the night with the Black Pearl, Braavos' famous courtesan, who was said to have finally warmed the Stark's icy heart. Flush with borrowed gold, Ned returned to King's Landing, and the loan was spent on weapons, supplies, horses, tents, anything needed to wage a campaign. The Red Wines of Fair Isle sent over their famous fleet, after Jon Arryn arranged a betrothal between Robert's youngest brother Renly and a Red Wine daughter. Not long after, the campaign supplies were loaded aboard, and the fleet set off for Pentos. Robert gave his crown to King Stannis, first of his name, who was more than a little relieved to see the thousands of rowdy men leave his court, although he gritted his teeth at the empty treasury. No love was lost between the two brothers, and the same could be said for Ned and his brother Brandon, the Lord Paramount of the North. Although a storm scattered the fleet, the Dragonhunt eventually managed to regroup just south of Pentos. The Second Sons, a mercenary band hired by Pentos to drive them back into the sea, was defeated, and its leader, Brown Ben Plum, agreed to join the ranks of Robert Baratheon's mercenary band. After the successful capture of Pentos and the installation of the tattered prince as the city's new ruler, Robert left the prince to his new reign of terror and headed back on campaign to chase down Rhaegar, now in charge of a small band of remaining Pentoshi enemies, which he called the Company of the Dragon. But the Targaryen and his company escaped and sought shelter in Volantis, finding protection in that huge and powerful city. Now the Dragonhunt has returned to its encampment south of Pentos. Rhaegar might have escaped his punishment for now, but these brave and ambitious men are not ones to give up after such a setback. Their army still numbers in the thousands, and though old Volantis still outnumbers them, the three daughters of Lys, Tyrosh, and Myr make for easy prey. Leave Stannis to his Iron Throne. Robert Baratheon, the sellsword king, will forge his own summer crown. Let all Targaryens beware. Storm Watch, a messy but brightly colored group of tents, surrounded by a hastily erected wooden palisade, served as the temporary headquarters of the Dragonhunt. Around the encampment, a ramshackle town of out-of-work soldiers, wine merchants, and whores had sprung up, mockingly called Robert's Landing. However, despite its unimpressive appearance, the arrival of the Dragonhunt had caused quite the stir in Essos. 6,000 well-armored knights and well-supplied footmen would make any magister nervous. Myr lay only a few days' ride away, and word reached Captain General Robert Baratheon that its banners had been called. And so, within the palisades of Stormwatch, he convened an important war council. His hand and friend, Ned Stark, pointed out that while the army was well supplied for now, the Dragonhunt's coffers would run empty sooner rather than later, especially considering the gigantic loan they had taken. The Iron Bank will have its due, Robert. Brynden Blackfish Tully, Robert's master-at-arms, was a man after Robert's own heart, with battle on the brain, and Brown Ben Plum, captain of the Second Sons, was by his side today. For once, the fighters agreed with the stewards. Staying at Stormwatch for much longer was unsustainable. The Blackfish had done some scouting. He had seen the armies of Myr convene, and its diplomats gather allies. He had counted the Dragonhunt's fighting men. Some 6,000 were encamped in Stormwatch, with the Second Sons commanding another 2,000 or 3,000. The Blackfish had also been training hundreds of runaway slaves, who had been pouring into Robert's Landing, looking for freedom and gainful employment. All in all, while Myr still outnumbered them, the difference was not that large. "Robert, we can do this, and if we don't do it now, we never will. The armies of Tyrosh and Qohor are due to arrive before month's end, and soon the slavers will outnumber us 3-1. Robert bellied out a deep laugh. "Huh! Let's get those bastards then. Tully, Plum, call the banners. It's time to show these Essosi bean counters some Westerosi steel. Tully, you'll command my left flank. As to my right, Kingslayer, what do you say?" Jaime Lannister had been guarding the tent entrance, but soon walked in, smirking. Robert Baratheon, Brynden Tully, and Jaime Lannister. How can I say no to such a maiden's fantasy? The Dragonhunt invasion took the Myrish by surprise. Camped outside of their city, waiting for reinforcements, the Myrish army of sellswords and slave soldiers saw the bright yellow banner with the pierced red dragon appear from a cloud of dust. The heavily armored Westerosi cavalry soon stormed their barely assembled lines, and a contingent of Northern and Stormlander shield infantry charged one of their flanks. Robert Baratheon, 6 foot tall and with his antlered helmet, made for a fearsome sight, and his giant warhammer made many a victim that day. Jaime Lannister too fought in the vanguard, and none were a match for his skill at arms. Despite their larger numbers, the Myrish had no answer for such an onslaught, and the day was soon won. The spectacle repeated itself on many a battlefield in the following months, and yet the sheer numbers of the enemy coalition of Myr, Tyrosh, Qohor, and Norvos often threatened to overwhelm the Dragonhunt, who only stayed alive due to the rigorous forced marches instigated by Commander Brynden Tully. It was clear that the diminished force would eventually be bled dry if nothing was done to prevent it. And so Robert swallowed his pride and asked his hand, Ned Stark, to ride a raven to the Eyrie, requesting the aid of Jon Arryn. It was not at all certain if Lord Jon would come through. After all, he had found the whole adventure preposterous in the first place. But in the end, Jon's friendship with Ned and Robert outweighed his misgivings. The extra soldiers from the Vale would tip the balance decisively in favor of the Dragonhunt, and after the storming of several smaller cities, Myr surrendered and opened its gates. Much treasure was carried off, and the Iron Bank was pleased. Geryon Lannister, the Master of Ships, had taken a liking to the stern and strong Mage Mormont of Bear Island during the war, and she had likewise fallen for his jovial charms. The two were married in the small wooden set erected at Robert's Landing. Eddard Stark, who had remained in Stormwatch to run the Dragonhunt's supply lines and finances, had trouble accepting the aggressive, undeclared war against Myr. In what many termed a bout of madness, he asked Robert if he could join the Night's Watch to regain his honor. Robert roundly rejected his friend's request. "I need you here, Ned. Surely righteous vengeance is more important than fighting snarks and grumpkins." Seeing his friend struggle, however, Robert granted him the lordship of the Daughter's March. As a landed lord, Ned would surely never make such a foolish request again. Ned Stark, now a landed Marcher Lord, protecting the Dragonhunt's border with Volantis, had found new purpose in his life. Not too long ago he had been ready to give up his quest for vengeance, petitioning Robert to join the Night's Watch. But his friend Robert had persuaded him otherwise, and it had been his lover and bodyguard Daisy Mormont, who had once again returned to him his old confidence. Ned realized that with her by his side, he could do anything, and so before the moon turned, Geryon Lannister took Ned and Daisy the short distance from Myr to the Rainwood, where they found a weirwood tree and married, with little fanfare. The war with the three daughters continued in the meantime. Tyrosh had joined the Myrish coalition against the Dragonhunt, and with Myr now defeated, Robert's armies turned to the west. Although the Dragonhunt had no navy to speak of, the Red Wine fleet having returned home, and so Tyrosh itself could not be captured, Robert's army could still wreak havoc on the Tyroshi mainland. What little forces the war-weary Tyroshi could still muster were defeated piecemeal, and most of the war was spent besieging their strong mainland fortifications. The Magister of Tyrosh, still controlling his island, bent the knee to the Dragonhunt, while the Tyroshi disputed lands were granted to Geryon Lannister, Master of Ships and Robert's companion since the beginning. This wasn't just a gesture of friendship, however, but also of reconciliation. Geryon's wife, Mage Mormont, had given birth to a child, William, black of hair, and many suspected him to be Captain General Robert's bastard son. Meanwhile, Robert's brother, King Stannis Baratheon of the Iron Throne, was not doing so well. Balon Greyjoy of the Iron Islands, Mace Tyrell of the Reach, and Brandon Stark of the North all demanded the right to wage war with other vessels and a reduction in the amount of levies owed to the crown. When Stannis refused, war broke out. While the crown was distracted with this insurrection, none other than Rhaegar Targaryen arrived at the shores of the Crown Lands, leading a Volantene fleet and army. The Dragon Prince had come to reclaim his throne. When hearing of the news, Robert is said to have swung his warhammer in anger, with such force that it shattered an oaken table. But there was nothing the Dragonhunt could do for the moment, not while the Tyroshi War was still going on. Lord Paramount Jon Arryn of the Vale, the longtime friend and father figure to Robert and Ned, who had served as Hand of the King to Stannis as well, despite the two not getting along, would die while the Dragonhunt fought Tyrosh. Leaving no heirs of his blood, the Vale passed to the Waynwoods. Jon Arryn left a young widow, Lysa Tully, just 20 years of age. Being the daughter of Hoster Tully, Lord Paramount of the Riverlands, and niece to Brynden Blackfish Tully, the girl made a natural match for Robert Baratheon himself, and he soon invited her over to Myr to get married. While Ned and Robert mourned their departed friend Jon, they could not pass up this opportunity for an alliance with the Riverlands. Rhaegar's invasion of the Iron Throne, meanwhile, ended in defeat. The treacherous dragon spawn was imprisoned by King Stannis. But to Robert's anger, he once again slipped away from his just punishment. King Stannis allowed him trial by combat, and the Targaryen bastard won by slaying Jesselyn Bywater. Stubborn Stannis, always a stickler for the rules, saw no option but to release him, and Rhaegar and his family were allowed to return to Volantis. My fool brother, you should have asked me to be his champion. I would have crushed that Targaryen skull like a ripe plum. Having let Rhaegar Targaryen escape, Stannis was not even able to defend his own family. During the rebellion and the Targaryen invasion, a peasant army had risen up in Storm's End, and to the realm's astonishment, managed to successfully siege down the impenetrable castle. Renly, the youngest Baratheon brother, was captured, and the peasant leader, Glendon Butler, proclaimed himself Lord of Storm's End and opened the gates to anyone who wished to have a say in its governance. The Council Republic was an oddity in Westeros, but was not immediately crushed, as Stannis did not have the men to spare. The king had just returned from enforcing royal rule on the rebellious Lord Brandon Stark of Winterfell. Ned's older, crippled brother was stripped of his wardenship, and the lords of the north were forced to swear fealty to King Stannis directly. In the months of peace following the conquest of Tyrosh, Robert Baratheon's Dragonhunt started to look and act like a proper kingdom. The city of Myr served as its new capital, and it was welcoming a large influx of people from Westeros. Workers and families, septons and soldiers, merchants and artisans were streaming into the depopulated city after making the short trip from the Stormlands or Crownlands, and soon the common tongue replaced the Myrish Valyrian dialect as the language on the street. Robert didn't spend much time in his new city, instead preferring to hunt game, train soldiers, or visit one of his many mistresses. Instead, his hand, Ned Stark, mostly held court in the partially rebuilt Prince's Palace. The new prestige of the Dragonhunt also attracted more noble visitors. On the recommendation of Brynden Blackfish Tully and his sister Lysa, Robert's wife, Ned invited Lothar Frey to Myr. The Tullys knew Lothar the Lame as the steward to Walder Frey, the Lord of the Twins, and had praised the man as a competent and shrewd administrator. They had also insinuated that the ambitious Lothar was not necessarily happy with his current position. Ned gave him another option, a powerful position in a realm triple the size of the Twins and controlling many times its population, on the Regency Council of a largely absent ruler. The deal was soon struck, and Lothar the Lame would serve the Dragonhunt capably in various capacities for many years. His skill for intrigue and subterfuge, something which did not come naturally to either Robert or Ned, would be especially appreciated. Despite Robert's infidelity, he did not neglect his new wife Lysa, and she bore him many children. Willem, his bastard with Mage Mormont, was soon followed by a true-born daughter, Eliana, and a year later by twins, a girl, Jaina, and a boy, Stefan, Robert's true-born son and heir. Ned Stark and Jaime Lannister immediately went looking for betrothal options, and they set their sights high. The daughter of Lord Paramount Mace Tyrell of the Reach, Margaery Tyrell, was a clever and pretty girl of 7. Marrying her would not only give the Dragonhunt a significant boost in legitimacy, but would also secure an alliance with the second most powerful man in the 7 Kingdoms. Lord Mace required much cajoling and many an expensive gift, but eventually he was convinced of the benefits of marrying into the Baratheon family and allying himself with a man controlling a veteran army nearly the size of Dorne's. Margaery and Stefan were betrothed, though it would be many years before the marriage was consummated. Unrest in Westeros continued. Balon Greyjoy, as yet unaware of the plans of his brother Euron to overthrow him, decided to make a bid for independence, while King Stannis was calling his banners to subjugate Glendon Butler, the peasant lord of Storm's End. In true boneheaded Ironborn fashion, he went on the attack. While Stannis was distracted, the Iron Fleet sailed around the continent, laying siege to King's Landing itself. Climbing its walls at night, a small contingent of Ironborn managed to capture one of the city's gatehouses, and soon the gate was opened, and thousands of Ironborn poured into the city. The sack was brutal, and though King Stannis escaped, Lord Balon took Queen Cersei Lannister as his sole wife, and kidnapped the princes Daemon and Michael. In the north, Brandon Stark, crippled Lord of Winterfell, made a similar bid to regain his wardenship of the north, which Stannis had entrusted to the Ryswells instead. Eventually, Brandon was successful, and the Starks regained their traditional rulership over the north. King Stannis accepted the new situation as a fait accompli, though he did demand fealty, which Lord Paramount Brandon readily gave. However, Brandon still suffered many health problems, and many remarked on how he moved and talked like an old man, despite having yet to reach his 30th name day. Eventually these problems overcame the Lord of Winterfell, and he died in his sleep, leaving the realm to the youngest of Rickard Stark's sons, Benjen. Ned, having long since accepted that he was not welcome in the north, sent a raven to Winterfell congratulating his young brother. He received no reply. But it wasn't like Ned wasn't needed in Myr. After a blissful period of peace and reconstruction, Robert barged into the halls of the prince's palace. "It's time to get off our arses and continue this dragon hunt, before that murderer Rhaegar tries something funny again. Lys is next. Tully, Ned, I now command an army larger than when I was still Lord of the Stormlands. Let's use it." With that, the third of the Daughters' Wars began. By now the dragon hunt outnumbered Lys, which had only recently suffered a major revolt, by at least 4-1. And through their conquest of Tyrosh, the Westerosi also commanded a large fleet. The decadent Lyseni stood no chance, and it wasn't long until the yellow banners with the pierced red dragon waved on top of the walls of Lys. All three daughters, Tyrosh, Myr, and Lys, were now subjugated, and the way was clear for the real prize, Volantis, and the Targaryen refugees it protected. Some 10 years after the arrival of Robert Baratheon on the shores of Essos with his band of mercenaries, Balon Greyjoy finally won his bid for independence. King Stannis at first wished to fight to the end, but Balon sacrificed Queen Cersei Lannister to the drowned god in a cruel ceremony, and he threatened to do the same to the young princes Dayne and Mihajlo Baratheon, still in his custody. Stannis agreed to grant independence to the Arryn Islands in exchange for his son's release. But Balon Greyjoy would not enjoy his sea-stone chair for long. War erupted again when the princes arrived back in King's Landing. Stannis, who had never been fond of his wife, quickly remarried to another young Lannister, Míriel, second cousin to Lord Tywin. In Myr, Lothar the Lame had replaced Ned Stark as Robert Baratheon's hand and de facto regent, and soon started using his position to gain favour with Tywin Lannister, Lord Paramount of the Westerlands. In a lengthy and detailed exchange of letters, the two came up with a plan. Robert Baratheon would invite Lord John Vance, second son in a rather minor Riverlander family, to join his court in Myr. Sir John, eager to prove himself, would accept, and he would take his new wife with him, none other than Catelyn Tully, daughter to Hoster Tully of the Riverlands and sister to Brynden and Lysa. She would be happy to join her family at Myr, and did not suspect anything when her lord husband's cart was robbed by bandits, leaving him dead in the wood. With Catelyn now single and close to her family, she agreed to join the dragon hunt through marriage to its master-at-arms, Jaime Lannister himself. The convoluted plan secured a marriage alliance between the Westerlands and Riverlands, earning Lothar the Lame his favour with a pleased Lord Tywin Lannister. Jaime did not mind the marriage. Catelyn was a beautiful woman, and the two shared a deep affection with Brynden Blackfish Tully, as well as close ties to Robert Baratheon, who was after all Catelyn's former brother-in-law. However, the three Tullys would not spend much time together in Myr. Just a short while after Jaime and Catelyn's marriage, a raven arrived in the rookery, with news of the death of Tywin Lannister himself. Jaime's uncle Kevan now called on him to assume his rightful inheritance. Jaime departed Myr with his newly beloved, and with mixed feelings. He left behind many friends, Robert, Ned, the Blackfish, even scrawny Howland Reed, and Casterly Rock would feel empty without his sister Cersei. Still, he knew that his honor had been restored. He had proudly served the dragon hunt in exile for much longer than the 7 years he had been sentenced to. His debt to society had been paid, and now it was time to start that lordly life with a clean conscience. Jaime's stories encouraged his brother Tyrion, the imp, and his uncle Kevan to depart for the dragon hunt as well. Tyrion out of a sense of adventure and a desire to learn, Kevan for more complicated reasons. He no longer trusted King Stannis. The king had imprisoned him on minor charges, and that he had only been released after a trial by combat between his nephew Jaime and the king's fighter Varys, who as it turned out had poisoned every part of his armor and weapon Jaime was likely to touch. The Lannisters had been lucky that Jaime had escaped with his life, and Kevan knew he must needs depart Westeros or face renewed punishment. Tyrion served Robert's hand Lothar as Master of Whisperers, while Kevan took up a position as his Master of Coin. With Tyrion's uncle Jerion already serving as Master of Laws, Robert Baratheon's council now had no less than 3 Lannisters on it. With Lys now properly subjugated, Robert and Ned felt it was time. We have delayed enough, Robert. Our army is strong and well trained. Volantis is a formidable foe, this is true. But we must not allow Rhaegar Targaryen to live out his days in peace and comfort. My sister's kidnapper must be brought to justice. Robert looked at his lifelong friend, more thoughtful than he had ever been. Then he nodded. Let's do it then. The war was brutal and bloody. The Dragonhunt, some 30,000 strong, moved swiftly and decisively, managing to pick its battles and terrain and defeat the enemy before they could manage to properly assemble. The military genius of the Blackfish, the bravery and charisma of Robert, the respect and obedience commanded by Ned Stark, all came together in this brilliant campaign. The glorious victories of the Dragonhunt in the War for the Dragon are well known in singers' ballads across all of Westeros. Half the Volantene army was cut off and destroyed at Letnir, and the rest of it was chased down to the black walls of Old Volantis itself. In what was perhaps its most impressive feat of arms, the walls, 200 feet high and made of fused black stone, were successfully stormed by the Dragonhunt. Behind them, praying alone in the middle of the gigantic temple of the Lord of Light, they found him, Rhaegar Targaryen. Ned stepped in first, then Brynden, then Lothar, Geryon and Daisy, and finally Robert Baratheon himself. Rhaegar did not resist his capture and willingly followed behind Robert's horse in chains all the way to Myr. Some say that since his departure from Old Town a decade ago, the prince had seen the day of his capture every night in his dreams. All the Targaryens were now locked up in the dungeons of the prince's palace in Myr, at the mercy of Robert Baratheon. All that is except one. Daenerys Targaryen, the 11-year-old daughter of the Mad King, had escaped Volantis on board of a Gulltown merchant ship, and had from there made her way to the Eyrie, accompanied by the men of Lord Horton Redford, a major vessel of Lady Paramount Caroline Waynwood of the Vale. Lord Horton acted as regent to the reclusive Lady Caroline, and had used his power and influence to secure a marriage between Princess Daenerys and his son, Sir John Redford. In Myr, the Westerosi immigrant population saw Captain General Robert more and more as a regular king. Kevan Lannister issued coins and levied taxes in his name, Geryon Lannister wrote laws and spoke justice in his name, and Lothar the Lame held court in what was in essence his royal palace. And though Robert would deny it until all Targaryens were dead, the Dragonhunt was essentially over. More and more, Robert's court and administration would adopt the name that the Septons used for Robert's realm, the Kingdom of the Summer Crown. They would also start to use an informal dating system, counting the years after Robert's landing on Essos. In the 11th year after Robert's landing, a smallpox epidemic broke out in the Kingdom of the Summer Crown. Being locked inside his palace while the disease raged outside, King Robert would pay many a visit to his dungeon. He gave particular attention to Rhaegar, mocking and taunting him, even ordering his guards to drag him out and torture him, sometimes even participating in the activity himself. He often dared Rhaegar to challenge him to a trial by combat, seeming anxious to meet the Dragon Prince in the arena. But Rhaegar never did. It seemed the Targaryen had accepted his fate the moment Ned Stark had entered the Temple of the Lord of Light in Volantis. Rhaegar Targaryen would die in the Mirror's dungeons, succumbing to an infection caused by one of his many torture wounds, about a year after his capture. Having been denied his vengeance on the dueling grounds, and no longer able to take out his wrath on Rhaegar himself, Robert stormed down to the dungeons when he heard the news. Having seen Rhaegar's body lying on the ground, he ordered the guards to open the cell next to him, which contained Rhaegar's brother Viserys. Once they had done so, Robert barged in, kicked Viserys down on the ground, and proceeded to strangle the young man with his bare hands. He wished to do the same thing with Rhaegar's children, Jaehaerys and Balon, but was stopped in the nick of time by a contingent of palace guards, acting on the orders of Geryon Lannister and Ned Stark. In the following weeks, Robert got into huge arguments with his council on what to do with the Targaryen boys. Robert demanded blood and wished to extinguish the hated Targaryen line. Ned and Geryon, as well as his brother, Kevan Lannister, thought this a perversion of justice. The murder of 2 children was not proportionate to the kidnapping of 1 woman, no matter how beloved she had been. And besides, Aerys was Lyanna's son, Ned's nephew. Unwilling to listen to reason, Robert ordered their execution regardless. Balon, a boy of 10, was executed in the palace courtyard. Ned was quiet when it happened, as he always was, but he had seen what his friend had turned into. The next morning, Ned's bed was empty. Robert's lifelong friend had departed for Winterfell, together with his nephew Aerys. Another Targaryen had escaped Robert's fury, and his arbitrary cruelty had cost him a lifelong friend besides. Although the killing of the Targaryens had made waves in Westeros as well, the realm was distracted by the spectacular trial by combat between Randyll Tarly, Lord of Hornhill, and his opponent and liege lord, Mace Tyrell of the Reach. Mace had been brave to the point of stupid by fighting Lord Randyll himself, but few had predicted that Randyll would actually slay his liege lord. The death of Mace Tyrell meant Willis Tyrell succeeded him as Lord Paramount of the Reach, and in Myr, Lothar the Lame wasted no time in proposing a betrothal with Robert's daughter Lyanna. Foolish duels would claim yet more important lives that year. Balon Greyjoy, once again a vassal to King Stannis, challenged his rival to a duel. Although he knew he was unlikely to win, Stannis felt honor-bound to accept the challenge. And yet again, the challenger did the unthinkable. Balon Greyjoy slew Stannis Baratheon by burying an axe in his face. He would be succeeded by a regency council ruling in the name of his 9-year-old son, Daemon. In the east, Robert Baratheon would fight yet another war with Volantis under dubious pretenses. The reality was, and had always been, that war was what Robert Baratheon was born to do, and the only thing besides food and drink that made him feel alive. The war was won when Brynden Tully killed the Triarch in single combat, and the Dragonhunt's victory led to the abolition of slavery in Volantis, among other things. But the aging Robert would not enjoy the spoils. His life had been spent drinking and whoring, and spending more of his time outdoors in cold and wet army camps than indoors. This lifestyle had finally caught up with the now middle-aged king. He returned from Volantis barely able to walk. Gout had reached his left foot, and pneumonia had reached his lungs. When the invite came to attend his nephew's coronation in King's Landing, Robert ignored the advice of his maester to stay in bed, taking a ship to the capital instead. When he reached the Red Keep, he was barely able to say goodbye to his estranged nephews and to his brother Renly, before he died, coughing up blood. An ignominious end to the most legendary warrior of his age. The death of Robert Baratheon ushered in a new era in the Kingdom of the Summer Crown, and it started with his legendary funeral. By now, every lord in Westeros had family or friends in Myr, and many of them were invited to what was one of the largest feasts any of them had ever seen. The population of Myr, already on par with some of the largest cities in Westeros, swelled during the event, as thousands of nobles arrived in the city, each with their own squires, wives and husbands and servants. They were closely followed by a throng of merchants, looking to profit from the flow of money that followed any gathering where lords and ladies had a chance to show off their wealth. Myr's own lens and lace makers experienced their most profitable time since their subjugation, and the funeral itself lived up to the high expectations. Apart from the lavish buffet of exotic food and spices, the Myrish green nectar and fire wine flowed freely in the prince's palace. Overseeing the festivities was young King Steffon Baratheon, who had barely seen his father in the 9 years since his first name day. On his right was his cunning, scheming regent, Lothar Frey, the true power behind the throne. As such an event did not take place often in Myr, many of King Steffon's subjects used the day after the funeral to ask for justice. Regent Lothar heard many accusations of murder and adultery leveled against him, which he haughtily dismissed. He was not so easy on his master of laws, Tyrion Lannister, whom he fined significant sums for having illicit relations with the wives of several noble lords. But the climax of these trials was the one against the Magister of Tyrosh, Ollo Rindoon, who had voluntarily subjugated himself to Robert Baratheon after the Second Daughters' War, was accused of libel and slander by Kevan Lannister, the realm's master of coin. While such an accusation would usually be punished with a fine, Lothar saw this as an opportunity to rid himself of a powerful and hostile vassal, and ordered the Magister's imprisonment. Ollo, outraged, demanded trial by combat, bringing forth his champion Tycho Aerys, a famous fighter from a prominent Tyroshi merchant family. Lothar requested the aid of Brynden Blackfish Tully, who despite his dislike of the man, felt honor-bound to accept the challenge. But the Blackfish, one of the most legendary commanders of his time, died by poisoned blade. Magister Ollo was found not guilty, but despite this failure, Regent Lothar had still rid himself of the Blackfish, who had been a powerful and influential man at court, and popular with the soldiers. A new master-at-arms had to be found to replace the Blackfish. Lord Lothar was hesitant to appoint a local man, as they could be a threat to his power. And so, on the recommendation of one of the Blackfish's lieutenants, a raven was sent to Wrath Rock, an island just off the shore of Cape Wrath in the Stormlands. The master-at-arms serving there, a low-born man by the name of Sir Aerys, had a reputation as a brave and noble knight, with significant skill with the blade, despite his advanced age, and as a great commander who had fought in many a war since the days of the Ninepenny Kings. Although none could replace the Blackfish, Aerys soon earned the respect of the court, and was allowed to continue training young King Stefan in the arts of war as his predecessor had done. Regent Lothar the Lame, meanwhile, continued to increase his power and wealth at the cost of the young king. In the months following Robert's funeral, he took for himself Robert's Landing, and even assumed direct control over the city of Lys, becoming the most powerful man in the kingdom by far. Not wishing to yield an inch of power even when Stefan came of age, he had the boy locked in the east wing of the prince's palace, where none could reach him except his guardian Aerys and Lothar himself. Lord Lothar was allowed to get away with this, not just because of his own machinations at court, but also due to the deaths of some of Robert's old advisors. Master of Laws Geryon Lannister's famous charm and wit had disappeared behind a cloud of sorrow after the death of his wife Alora, whom he had loved dearly despite his indiscretions. He blamed himself for her death, and would die in his stately villa of depression, shame and guilt. Kevan Lannister, Geryon's brother and master of coin, had reached an advanced age and would die of natural causes. Both Lannisters were replaced with newly imported men, who owed their loyalty to Lord Lothar. A low-born Stormlander knight by the name of Sir Courtney, who was a clever and ambitious diplomat with a penchant for food and drink, replaced Geryon as Master of Laws. Sir Axel Florent, pious scion of that ancient and noble house, and brother to Lord Alistair Florent of Brightwater Keep, joined as Master of Coin. In the north of Westeros, Lord Paramount Benjen Stark was slain in a trial by combat, and succeeded by his infant son Rickard under the regency of Lord Jorah Mormont of Bear Island. Lord Jorah was aided by Ned Stark and his nephew, Jaehaerys Targaryen. Ned had tried to pass Jaehaerys off as his bastard son, but the young man's age, white hair, and thick Volantine accent made that impossible. Still, he was the son of Ned and Benjen's beloved sister Lyanna, and was soon accepted into the Stark court, becoming known as Jon Whitewolf and adopting a Stark sigil with the colors reversed. There was also news of war. A boy claiming to be Aegon Targaryen himself, Rhaegar's son, thought to have died before Robert's Landing, invaded the Crown lands at the head of the Golden Company. While enemies of King Daemon Baratheon saw many parallels with Robert's Landing in Essos 19 years earlier, none dared to openly join the false dragon against the united Iron Throne. None, that is, except Balon Greyjoy, the bane of the King's Landing Baratheons and murderer of King Daemon's father Stannis. While the royal army was distracted fighting the Golden Company, Ironborn raiders once again snuck into the Red Keep and lifted Daemon off his bed, just as they had done many years ago. Once again, Balon exchanged Daemon Baratheon for his independence, this time without sacrificing his mother to the drowned god. Though he had lost one of the 7 kingdoms, Daemon had kept the other 6. While the king was imprisoned on Pike, his armies defeated Aegon, the Mummer's dragon, who was executed shortly after. In the 20th year after Robert's Landing, King Daemon Baratheon of the Iron Throne once more fought to subjugate the Iron Islands. The headstrong berserker Balon Greyjoy, who had captured him twice and had killed his father Stannis, could not be allowed to remain independent, and was soon subjugated once more. Still, Daemon did not consider his debt fulfilled. Subjugation was not enough. Balon should die by his hand. Considering what happened to King Daemon's father, many thought it the height of foolishness, but Daemon needed to satisfy his honor. He challenged Balon Greyjoy to a duel. Against the wishes of many, but to the surprise of few, the Berserker Ironborn, one of the most famous warriors of his age, bested the young king easily and left him dead on the dueling grounds. In the east, King Steffon of the Summer Crown came of age in captivity. The evil regent Lothar Frey continued to rule in his name, while Steffon was locked away in the east wing of the palace. This situation would persist for months, until Steffon managed to escape and enlist the help of Howland Reed and the other members of the royal bodyguard. Lothar the Lame was confronted in the throne room of the prince's palace, and though he managed to escape justice at first, a quick siege of his castle Morgos saw his imprisonment, the revocation of all his landed titles, and eventually his beheading. The Baratheons were once again in control of the kingdom they had forged. Tyrion Lannister was appointed as the new hand, while Steffon's mother, Lysa Tully, served as the realm's master of whisperers in his stead. One of the first acts King Steffon undertook was to secure a marriage to his beloved twin sister, Jaina. The two had been close in their youth, as close as only twins can be, so Steffon wanted his sister to have a good life and was willing to spend highly to achieve it. Steffon had set his sights high. His sister was to marry the new King of the Iron Throne, his cousin, Mihajlo Baratheon, who had succeeded his brother Daemon after the latter had been slain by Balon Greyjoy. It took many a bribe and expensive gift, but Mico eventually accepted the offer to marry his cousin. Queen Jaina Baratheon of the Iron Throne would enter King's Landing in triumph. Twin kingdoms with twin rulers. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. After having secured this marriage, however, Steffon would not get to enjoy his kingdom for long. A religious revolt in Lys, led by a local zealot by the name of Pyrrhios, would soon occupy the city itself. King Steffon led a force of some 12,000, and once they disembarked on the shores of the island city, a huge battle took place. While the forces of the Summer Crown outnumbered the Lyseni rebels, Pyrrhios knew King Steffon personally led the army and chased him down on the battlefield. Wearing the Blackfish's armor, King Steffon put up a good fight, but eventually he was slain on the field of battle by the Lyseni zealot. Even without Steffon's leadership, the revolt was crushed, but the king lay dead in the field. He was succeeded by his unremarkable and cruel brother, Oliver Baratheon. At least the king knew love before the end. The love that Steffon bore his wife Margaery Tyrell was well known to all singers under the Summer Crown. This could not be said for King Mihajlo Baratheon of the Iron Throne. He had barely come to know his new wife Jaina, before he once again foolishly attempted to take revenge on Balon Greyjoy. Another duel took place, another bloody mess ensued. Balon had killed his third Baratheon king. His status among the Ironborn was now legendary. King Oliver Baratheon, meanwhile, started his rule with a lackluster coronation ceremony and some arbitrary and borderline tyrannical imprisonments. Many would have preferred his brother and heir, Cameron, whom, men said, was a true knight, strong, brave, a skilled warrior, kind and patient, and adhering to the codes of courtly love. He stood in shrill contrast to his brother the king, who was widely known to be unjust, envious, fat, and sanctimonious. Only months into King Oliver's rule, about half of his vassals refused to pay their tribute, intending to ignore all orders from the king in Myr from now on. This group included the ungrateful Mark Wiswell and Ethan Glover, who owed everything they had to Oliver's father, and Morio Tumitis of Tyrosh and Taganaro Seldoris of the Northern Marches. It seemed the young king needed to prove himself. This disobedience would be put down by the sword. The Great Revolt against the rule of the Summer Crown Baratheons started in the 27th year after Robert's Landing. The lords Mark Wiswell, Ethan Glover, Morio Tumitis, and Taganaro Seldoris all attempted to rid themselves of cruel King Oliver Baratheon in Myr. Oliver still had the support of two Lannisters, Joffrey Lannister, son of Geryon in the west, and Lancel Lannister, son of Kevan in the east. But the rebels controlled a larger army than the loyalists, and the war was an existential threat, which could potentially end the Baratheon adventure in the east forever. The first battle of the war took place at Robert's Landing itself. Morio Tumitis, Magister of Tyrosh, had landed at the town with a large force, intending to seize its palisades and establish a defensible beachhead for his allies. He was confident in his superiority after the defeat of a loyalist scouting party, but this was premature. Loyalist forces poured into Myr in the following weeks, and eventually King Oliver and his brother Cameron led an army almost double that of the Tyroshi to relieve Robert's Landing. Oliver, eager to prove himself to his remaining vassals as being equal to his brother in combat prowess, challenged Magister Morio to a duel on the battlefield, but the Tyroshi fled. The Battle of Robert's Landing was a resounding victory for the Baratheons, and an auspicious sign. After the battle and the subsequent chase, the Loyalist army soon headed south, to the lands of Ethan Glover and Mark Riswell. Some minor castles were taken, but no major battles took place, before King Oliver's army was forced to head back north to relieve the capital. A large army, once again led by Magister Morio of Tyrosh, was besieging Myr itself, and the Battle of Myr, the largest battle of the war, was once again a Baratheon victory. The king's younger brother, Cameron Baratheon, distinguished himself with his father's mighty warhammer, and some say he looked like Robert come again. Once Myr had been relieved, the royal army headed back south to retake more rebel castles. In the Battle of Messilosh, King Oliver finally saw a chance to make a name for himself. In the heat of combat, he encountered one of the rebel leaders, Ethan Glover, Dragonhunt veteran, who had been made lord by Oliver's father after the Second Daughters' War. Regarded as a just and fair man, Lord Ethan had been paranoid about King Oliver's arbitrary whims, and forced to pick the side of the rebels against his cruel king. Now Oliver met his foe in the field, and the young king, skilled with a blade, found a weak spot in the 54-year-old Ethan's armor. One of the 4 leaders of the rebellion drowned in a pool of his own blood, nearly 2 years into the Great Revolt. The rebels, however, soon had their revenge. During the Second Battle of Messilosh, some 6 months later, Bakario Tumitis, son of Morio Tumitis, the Magister of Tyrosh, and the strongest of the rebel lords, met King Oliver in the field. Though the king had proven his skill in arms, Bakario was known to be an excellent duelist, trained in the art of the water dance by Barfosi sword masters. The two were evenly matched, but when Oliver had forced Bakario down on the ground, the Tyroshi produced a dagger and stabbed the king through his visor. Secretly, the realm breathed a sigh of relief. Oliver was succeeded by his brother Cameron, who was lifted up on a chair that night by the victorious royal soldiers. Oliver, an unlikely and unloved king, had met a tragic end to his tragic life. The war in the south was now over. Ethan Glover was dead, and Mark Riswell was soon imprisoned and later executed. That just left Daganaro Seldoris of the Northern Marches and Morio Tumitis, the Magister of Tyrosh. Cameron had been one of the few men in the realm to love his brother Oliver, as he loved his entire family. But he had no time to grieve. All rebels needed to be dealt with. Lord Daganaro was first. The campaign in the north was a grueling series of sieges, taking place over the course of the next year. Eventually, the castle of Long Lake was successfully stormed, and Lord Daganaro was imprisoned, along with his entire family. His castle and lands were given to Oliver Withers, a competent steward and friend of Queen Marjorie, who had hastily married Cameron after the death of Oliver, her third Baratheon husband. Only the Magister of Tyrosh was still in open rebellion against the throne, feeling secure behind the thick walls of fused black dragonstone. King Cameron sent out a call to all those who specialized in siege warfare, to aid him in the capture of the nigh impenetrable fortress. Many competent men arrived at his court, including Sir Balon Swan, who ended up breaking Tyrosh's walls through a shrewd combination of a naval blockade, the use of sappers who burrowed away underneath the walls, and the unprecedented construction of siege towers on top of ships, who proceeded to float alongside Tyrosh's smaller seaside walls. Eventually the city was captured, and King Cameron seized the bleeding tower guarding its harbour for himself. The young king now held Myr, Tyrosh and Lys as personal fiefdoms, making him one of the most powerful and wealthiest men on the narrow sea. Baratheon rule seemed secure for another generation. That is, if Cameron and Marjorie would produce an heir. With the Great Revolt now over, and King Cameron now in tentative but direct control of Tyrosh, Myr and Lys, there was a period of relative peace while the realm rebuilt. Joffrey Lannister, who together with his cousin Lancel had been the only major vessel to remain loyal to the crown, was rewarded with a position as Hand of the King. He was also knighted by King Cameron himself after the war. Lord Joffrey, the son of Tyrion Lannister, would serve the realm loyally and ably for many years. It was during and after the revolt that Willem the Wayward, the bastard-born oldest son of Robert Baratheon, made his famous travels. Sir Willem travelled all over Essos, from Braavos to Yunkai, even visiting a Dothraki wedding. His autobiography and travelogue, Travels of Willem the Wayward, published posthumously, would, for a time, surpass even Lomas Longstrider's work Wonders Made by Man in popularity. Sir Willem also spent several years at the court of Gresdan VII, ruler of New Guise, giving some of the most vivid and detailed descriptions of its pyramids and iron legions. Eventually, however, he was called back to the Summer Crown by his brother Cameron, to aid in mopping up the last of the rebel forces and advise the new king. Cameron, still childless, also decided to recognize his brother as his legitimate heir and arranged a marriage with Joanna Lannister, daughter of the late Tyrion. 31 years after Robert's landing, the tattered prince, the conqueror king of Pentos, died in his sleep, aged 76. The great empire he had taken for himself crumbled immediately after his death, with the cities of Norvos, Qohor and Lorath once again gaining their independence. The chaotic power vacuum that resulted saw many hungry eyes fall on the region. King Cameron Baratheon looked warily at his rivals in Volantis. If they were to secure Norvos and Qohor for themselves, they would control all trade along the River Rhoyne, at the expense of Summer Crown prosperity. The king, with the approval of his hand Joffrey Lannister and his adventurous half-brother Willem the Wayward, decided to take the initiative and secure the northern Rhoyne for himself. His armies gathered west of the Sorrows, marching through that broken land to the city of Qohor. Capturing the gateway to the east, thus securing a direct overland trade route to the Dothraki Sea, would make Myr one of the wealthiest cities on the continent. But it was also a hazardous undertaking, possibly the most ambitious war fought by the Dragonhunt so far. Thousands of Westerosi knights and Free City sellswords found their deaths in the dark forests of Qohor, and King Cameron took a great risk in leaving his newly secured cities undefended. Still, once his armies reached Qohor, the city itself, designed to withstand Dothraki raids and not professional Westerosi siege equipment, fell quickly with the help of siege expert Balon Swan. King Cameron intended to press his advantage fully, ousting all Qohori lords from their castles, but huge revolts broke out in Tyrosh and Lys, forcing him to return to the west. Balon Swan, hero of Qohor and Tyrosh, was granted a well-deserved lordship, while Willem the Wayward, who had gained valuable experience dealing with Qohori and Dothraki on his many travels, was proclaimed Steward of Qohor. Lord Willem, given a free hand in ruling his new city, would secure the allegiance of the remaining Qohori lords, and would secure a trade route along the Rhoyne by the construction of river galleys to drive out the Dagger Lake pirates. The end goal was to restore the Valyrian road running east from Myr to the ruins of Chroyane in the Sorrows, setting up a trading port in the shadows of that ancient city. This would drive valuable trade away from Volantis and Braavos. However, to achieve this grand and ambitious plan, King Cameron first needed to quell the revolts in Tyrosh and Lys. Lys was dealt with via overwhelming force. Cameron took no chances with the unruly city, knowing that his brother Steffon had died in the previous Lyseni revolt. Tyrosh repelled the first attempt at reconquest, leaving perhaps a larger number of soldiers dead in its seas than had died in the entire war on Qohor. The second invasion, however, was successful. King Cameron did not immediately dissolve his armies, however. Some rebel Tyrosi had fled to the Stepstones, and the king had been looking for an excuse to secure some of the pirate-infested islands for himself, reducing the piracy which plagued overseas trade. 3 islands were captured without much trouble, and to rule them, Cameron invited his sister Jaina, former queen of the Iron Throne. Jaina had remarried after the death of King Mico, to a charming, humble Stormlander man by the name of Orson Trumbull. This Orson was granted rulership over the 3 new Stepstones, claiming the old fort on Bloodstone, built by Daemon Targaryen, as his seat. Having installed his brother-in-law Orson Trumbull as Marcher Lord of Bloodstone, King Cameron wasted little time exploiting this foothold in the Stepstones. 30 years after Robert's landing, he continued his conquest of the pirate-infested islands. To the delight of the powerful merchants of Tyros, Myr and Lys, the veteran army of the Dragonhunt, experienced with amphibious assaults, paired with the combined fleet of the three cities, proved a deadly combination to the poorly armed pirate rebel. King Cameron was able to do in about 18 months what took Daemon Targaryen many years. He subjugated every single island and burned down every pirate refuge. Secure bases and regular patrols now meant that Myrish and Tyroshi trade vessels could pass through the straits freely, and King Cameron and his brother-in-law Orson could even levy a healthy toll to foreign merchants wishing to pass. After Qohor, the Stepstones were now the second de facto kingdom under the sovereignty of King Cameron in Myr. The prestige of the Baratheons in the east grew, in Westeros as well as in Essos, and many began to see the realm of the Summer Crown no longer as a simple adventurer kingdom, but as a true equal to the Iron Throne itself. King Cameron encouraged this line of thinking by appointing his own lords paramount. Willem the Wayward and Orson Trumbull, rulers of Qohor and the Stepstones, both gained the title, and the king also appointed Joffrey Lannister and Amory Florent as lords paramount of Tyros and Lys, although he kept the cities themselves under his direct control. A stubborn outbreak of winter fever stopped any major wars for a time. The winter in the mid-30s after Robert's landing lasted many years, and even strong King Cameron and his young son and heir Prince Robert were bedridden with the disease for a while. During this long epidemic, the last of Robert Baratheon's old advisors passed away bedridden. Howland Reed, the famous warrior who had been with the Dragonhunt for 33 years and had trained most of the Baratheon children as master-at-arms, including King Cameron himself, was no more. King Cameron's entire council was now made up of new men who knew no other reality than that of a Westerosi king in Myr. Howland Reed was replaced by the most prominent among these new men, Willem the Wayward Baratheon, Lord Paramount of Qohor. Despite the epidemic, the coffers of the realm were full. The subjugation of the Stepstones meant many Essosi ships found their way to Myr again. Willem the Wayward had similarly crushed piracy on the northern Rhine and Dagger Lake, ensuring a relatively safe river route to Qohor. This opened up a potential overland trade route from Myr to Qohor for the first time in centuries. However, while some daring merchants already traded along it, that route still led through the Sorrows, the foggy, grayscale-infested ruins of the old kingdom of the Rhoynar. King Cameron thus decided to invest a great deal of money in the restoration of one of those foggy settlements on the west side of Dagger Lake. The project would take many years, but, it was hoped, would secure the route, giving Myr overland trade access to the Far East, like Pentos and Bravos. Hundreds of workers, accompanied by 200 men-at-arms, set to work on Dagger Lake once the last traces of the winter fever epidemic had passed. However, the Volantene had the same idea. They had sent workers to the capital of the old Rhoynish kingdom, the legendary city of Croyane. While dozens died to grayscale and many to the wrath of the Stone Men, the work had continued. King Cameron wished to maintain control of the entire northern Rhoyne, and so he could not allow the Volantene to maintain control of the crucial choke point at Croyane. War was declared between the two rival realms for the first time in decades. But this time, King Cameron meant to secure actual territory, rather than just a dragon prince or some freed slaves. The war on the Rhoyne between the Summer Crown and Volantis started off with the siege of Croyane. The city, full of stone men and disease, cost many Summer Crown soldiers their lives, but eventually its broken walls were no match for King Cameron's experienced army. In the south, the Westerosi suffered a significant setback. The first Battle of Silkhead was a crushing Volantene victory. However, once Croyane had been secured, King Cameron sailed his army downstream the Rhoyne to Volantis to combine with the remnants of that battle. The reinforced army headed back to Silkhead, and the Volantene army, having failed to press their advantage, was crushed in return. The rest of the war consisted mostly of sieges and minor skirmishes, but once the Summer Crown army successfully stormed the walls of Volantis itself, the Triarch sued for peace. Chroyane was granted to the Dragonhunt, and King Cameron now controlled the entire Rhine River north of that city. Even though the Targaryens were effectively all dead, King Edric Baratheon of the Iron Throne still had to contend with their offspring. Horton Redford, the son of Daenerys Targaryen and Jon Redford, made a bid to press his claim on the Iron Throne. Although he brought the largest army of any of the recent Targaryen claimants, he didn't fare any better than his uncle Rhaegar or his cousin Aegon. The Baratheons had been in charge of the Iron Throne for nearly 50 years, and the realm had gotten used to their presence. The Targaryens had become old news, and though they still mustered up plenty of support among Essosi adventurers, there were no real Targaryen loyalists among King Edric's major vassals. Prince Robert, the son of King Cameron Baratheon, was growing up to be a skilled fighter under the tutelage of his father and his uncle Willem. The boy was a devout follower of the Seven, but was very conscious of his high position and did not mince words when talking to his courtiers, causing offense to many of them. He was also highly ambitious and ruthless in achieving his goals. His father saw a lot of potential in the boy, and soon arranged a betrothal with the 7-year-old daughter of Lord Paramount Rickard Stark of the North, a girl by the name of Lyra. While Horton Redford fought for his Targaryen heritage, the Kingdom of the Summer Crown experienced a period of peace and prosperity. This ended when some border skirmishes between Willem the Wayward of Qohor and the Magister of Norvos revealed the weakness of Qohor's neighbour. Encouraged by his half-brother, King Cameron decided to try and take advantage of Norvos' weakness to further secure his hold on the great forests and trade routes of northern Essos. If King Cameron and Willem had expected an easy, quick war, they were mistaken. The free cities of Pentos and Lorath, threatened by Baratheon expansionism, joined on the side of Norvos. The Great Northern War had begun. Fearing Pentos much more than he did Norvos, King Cameron quickly moved north into the Pentoshi lands, hoping to enact a decisive, preemptive blow. But the armoured knights and footmen of the Summer Crown moved slowly in the mountainous terrain, and it took months before the king could enforce a pitched battle in terrain favourable to a cavalry charge. But in the summer of the 53rd year after Robert's landing, he managed to corner the Pentoshi army, crushing them in a series of battles at Arkun and Aminos, about 100 leagues south of Pentos. While King Cameron was chasing Pentoshi in the west, Willem the Wayward was slowly capturing mountain fortresses in Norvos itself, constantly harassed by the armies of Norvos and Lorath. While not as glorious as King Cameron's mobile campaigns in Pentos and, later, on the Rhine River, Lord Willem's capture of one fortress after the other meant that the goal of keeping Norvos independent was looking increasingly unrealistic to the anti-Baratheon alliance. After about 2 years of brutal warfare, they sued for peace. Norvos was added to the Kingdom of the Summer Crown, although the city itself would hold out for a few more years. The Great Northern War had been the most brutal conflict in Essos since the days of the Triarchy, and might well have spelled the end of Westerosi rule had the Summer Crown not been led by such excellent commanders as Cameron and Willem Baratheon. But Willem the Wayward had spent too much time in the cold mountain passes of Norvos. The 51-year-old son of Robert Baratheon and Mage Mormont, who had travelled the world in his youth and had ruled as Lord of Qohor for so many years, passed away in his sleep. Hundreds of manuscript pages were found in his chest. The source for Travels of Willem the Wayward, the famous travelogue and autobiography that would immortalize the man. While the two had drifted apart over the years, King Cameron still mourned the loss of one of his most capable and trusted lieutenants. 55 years after his older brother had given up the Iron Throne and moved to Essos, Renly Baratheon decided that he would make for a better king than Stannis and his sons. And so he rallied his banners and his allies to press his claim and take the crown from his nephew Edric. One of those allies was the son of his older brother, King Cameron of the Summer Crown. After much debate with his council, King Cameron decided to accept the call to arms. King Renly had been a loyal ally, having aided in the war on the Rhine and the Great Northern War, and even during the Great Revolt, and it was time to repay that debt. Renly's rebellion was a bloody affair. The Trident, the Stormlands and the Summer Crown stood against the forces of King Edric, as well as Westerlands, Vale and Reach. Dawn did not care who won and so remained neutral, while the North was embroiled in the Karstark revolt, to depose Rickard II, son of Benjen Stark, in favour of the old Eddard Karstark. Despite the absence of these two powerful lords, Renly's coalition was still outnumbered, but with the full support of the veteran armies and commanders of the Dragonhunt, he hoped to punch above his weight. Some 30,000 soldiers in strange, colorful garbs, speaking the common tongue with odd accents, disembarked on the shores of Storm's End that spring. They relieved the besieged castle from its Tyrell attackers and moved south along the coast to defeat Lannister armies at Crow's Nest and the Rainwood. King Cameron knew the terrain well, and these early victories did much to rally the Stormlander lords to Renly's cause. After receiving reinforcements from the east, the Summer Crowners headed north along the King's Road, defeating a gathering Westerman force outside of the walls of King's Landing itself. A first relief force from the Vale was soundly defeated, and the siege of King's Landing could begin in earnest. While by Westerosi standards, the capital's defences were formidable, King Cameron had sieged down the double dragonstone walls of Tyrosh and the famous black walls of Volantis, thick enough for 12 horses to ride abreast. Compared to that, King's Landing was easy enough to take. The trusted combination of a naval blockade, sappers and siege towers soon saw the Summer Crown army swarm into the city. Waves of enemy soldiers attempted to retake the capital, while King Cameron was on campaign in the Stormlands, but he returned to the city quickly. The Second Battle of King's Landing was the largest engagement of the war, and it was another resounding victory for Renly. With the Red Keep still in Summer Crown hands despite their best efforts, the remaining loyalists saw their cause was hopeless, and handed King Edric over to King Cameron. Cameron invited his uncle Renly to come down to the capital from his Riverland campaigns. A peace treaty was signed, and old Renly Baratheon was crowned the new king of the Iron Throne. He would not enjoy his crown for long. Only months after his victory, the elderly king collapsed in the throne room, never to get up again. Renly's son, Ronald Baratheon, would succeed his father as king. He was a muscled giant of a man, nevertheless known for being calm and sympathetic, if a bit of a recluse. The sudden death of King Renly also highlighted the issue of King Cameron's widowhood. Ever since the death of his beloved queen, Margaery Tyrell, who had passed away in her sleep 12 years ago, Cameron had not shown much interest in remarrying. However, his advisors, Orson Trumbull and Joffrey Lannister, urged the king to remarry. Crown Prince Robert, Cameron's only son, did not have any children of his own yet, and should Cameron and Robert both die, there was no clear successor, and the realm would surely erupt in civil war. To shut them up more than anything, King Cameron married Benissa, a low-born friend of one of his commanders, and well known for her astute intellect and admirable moral code. While it was not a marriage of love, the two enjoyed spending time together, and there was a clear physical as well as a mental attraction, which soon resulted in the birth of a daughter, Mary. The next years in the Kingdom of the Summer Crown were unruly. The campaign against the remnants of Norvos continued, but was interrupted by a large uprising of followers of the Red God. This band of religious rebels, opposed to the spread of the Westerosi faith of the Seven, even managed to capture the prince's palace in Myr, looting and pillaging the Baratheons' valuables and taking their courtiers hostage. King Cameron, however, soon returned from the cold north to deal with them. It was after the defeat of the Red God Rebellion that news reached the court of the death of Jaehaerys Targaryen, or Jon White Wolf, the baby that Ned Stark had taken north to rescue it from the wrath of Robert Baratheon. This last son of Rhaegar Targaryen left behind a son and a daughter of his own, who retained their nominal claim on the Iron Throne, but, like the Redfords, did not gain any support for it.